The truth is, a lake doesn't disappear overnight unless someone finally stops pretending it belongs to everybody. By sunrise, 57 luxury boats leaned sideways in thick black mud where $5 million of polished docks had floated the evening before. Expensive yachts rested at impossible angles. Gulls wandered across cracked lakebed that had been hidden for decades, and television crews stood speechless while homeowners in matching resort polos shouted at engineers who were quietly checking water gauges instead of panicking. In the middle of it all stood Victoria Ashcroft, her bright designer jacket sparkling under the morning sun, oversized sunglasses sliding down her face as she screamed at anyone wearing a hard hat. She kept pointing toward the empty shoreline, as if yelling loudly enough could convince the water to come back. The strange part was that nobody from the federal inspection team looked surprised. One inspector simply unfolded another survey map, while another compared water elevation numbers against documents older than anyone standing there. I stayed behind the yellow safety tape without saying a word. The cool morning breeze carried the smell of wet clay instead of fresh lake water, and every gust reminded me of summers spent fishing this shoreline with my grandfather long before anyone had ever imagined luxury condos or private marinas. A television reporter noticed me standing alone beside an old concrete spillway covered with faded government markings. She hurried over, microphone already raised, asking if I knew what had happened to the lake. I looked past her toward the rows of stranded boats and answered as calmly as I could. The lake is exactly where it's supposed to be. She frowned, clearly expecting something dramatic, but before she could ask another question, Victoria spotted me. Even from 200 feet away, I could hear her voice cutting through the crowd. "That's him," she shouted. "That's the man who destroyed our marina." Cameras turned toward me all at once. Homeowners stared like I had personally stolen their vacation homes. Reporters began jogging across the muddy shoreline, careful not to ruin expensive shoes. The smell of damp earth mixed with diesel fuel from idle news vans filled the air while helicopters circled overhead, their steady rhythm echoing across the valley. I watched Victoria march toward me as fast as her heels would allow, waving perfectly manicured hands in every direction. She looked exactly like she had at every HOA meeting I'd ever attended. Confident, overdressed, convinced the loudest voice automatically became the truth. "You drained our lake," she yelled. I almost corrected her, but there was no point. It had never been their lake. Behind her, workers stared helplessly at hundreds of feet of exposed pilings supporting the massive marina. Million-dollar gangways now ended in empty air. Decorative fountains sat silent. Rental kiosks leaned crookedly over drying mud. Every shiny piece of waterfront luxury depended on something Victoria had never bothered to verify before spending millions of other people's money. Ownership. The oldest county surveyor present finally walked toward us carrying a weathered leather folder thick with folded maps and yellowed deeds. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply looked at Victoria and asked one question. "Did your board ever receive written authorization from the owner before constructing permanent facilities over private waters?" Her expression changed for the first time that morning. The confidence cracked just enough for everyone nearby to notice. She looked toward her attorneys. They suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Nobody answered. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer than any courtroom verdict I'd ever witnessed. Standing there beside the spillway, breathing air that smelled like rain-soaked clay instead of lake water, I realized every decision that had led to this morning had started 36 hours earlier, when I drove back to the family cabin expecting nothing more exciting than replacing an old dockboard and watching the sunset over the quiet water my grandfather had spent his entire life protecting. I had absolutely no idea I was about to discover a $5 million marina sitting on my private lake. Nobody inherits a lake by accident. My family earned every acre of it one season at a time. 36 hours earlier, I had turned off the highway onto the same narrow county road I had traveled since I was 6 years old. The familiar crunch of gravel beneath my truck tires sounded exactly the way I remembered, steady, dry, comforting. The air carried the scent of pine trees mixed with fresh water, and for the first time in nearly 8 months, I felt like I could finally breathe without looking at a project schedule. My name is Nathan Cole. I am 39 years old, and I have spent my entire career as a hydraulic engineer designing flood control systems, reservoirs, and water management projects across the western United States. Most people think lakes are peaceful places. I see elevations, spillways, drainage basins, and decades of engineering hidden beneath the surface. My grandfather, Walter Cole, taught me that long before I earned my degree. He never called himself an engineer because he never attended college, but he understood water better than anyone I have ever met. He used to tell me that water never cared about opinions. It only respected gravity, patience, and preparation. Every Saturday morning, we walked the shoreline together carrying old survey maps folded so many times the edges had become soft like cloth. He showed me every stone retaining wall, every drainage channel, every marker driven into the ground decades before I was born. By the time I was 12 years old, I could identify every culvert around the property without looking at a map. My father expanded what my grandfather started. During the 1980s, he worked with county officials and state environmental engineers to modernize the spillway while preserving the original permits. They never tried turning the lake into a tourist attraction. It was simply home. We fished from the same cedar dock every summer. We repaired fences every spring. We cleared fallen branches after every storm. Some families handed down jewelry. Mine handed down maintenance logs, water level records, inspection reports, and a quiet belief that taking care of something mattered more than showing it off. When my parents passed the property to me, they also passed along shelves filled with neatly labeled binders that documented almost 70 years of ownership. Every permit renewal, every survey update, every inspection certificate sat exactly where my father had left it. I never imagined those records would become more valuable than the land itself. My engineering career often kept me away for months at a time, supervising infrastructure projects from Colorado to Arizona, but I always came back to the cabin whenever work allowed. Even after exhausting weeks spent around construction equipment and concrete, the first thing I always noticed was the silence. No traffic, no crowded marinas, no music echoing across the water, just wind moving through tall pines and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. That quiet was worth more to me than any luxury resort could ever promise. The cabin itself remained almost unchanged since my grandfather built it. The wooden porch creaked in the same places. The stone fireplace still smelled faintly of cedar smoke. His old coffee mug remained on the kitchen shelf because nobody ever found a reason to move it. Every visit reminded me that this property represented more than real estate. It represented responsibility. I parked beside the equipment shed that afternoon, expecting another peaceful weekend of small repairs before returning to work on Monday. I even packed a new set of dock boards because one section had begun showing its age during my previous visit. Instead of hearing birds and moving water, I caught something completely unfamiliar drifting across the trees. Music, engines, laughter. Then came the distant blast of a boat horn. I stopped unloading my truck and listened again. The sounds were coming from the direction of the lake. At first I assumed someone had wandered onto the shoreline by mistake. Then another horn echoed across the valley, followed by applause from what sounded like a large crowd. I set the lumber down, closed my tailgate, and started walking toward the water, completely unaware that every peaceful memory I had carried back with me was about to collide with something I never believed anyone would be bold enough to build. The trail curved around a stand of old pine trees before opening onto the western shoreline, and I stopped so suddenly that the toolbox slipped from my hand and landed in the dirt with a dull thud. The quiet cove where my grandfather had taught me to cast a fishing line had vanished beneath polished wooden docks stretching hundreds of feet into the water. White yachts bobbed gently beside floating platforms lined with decorative lights. A two-story waterfront clubhouse overlooked the marina with floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Bright banners welcomed visitors to Willow Harbor Community Marina, and a steady line of golf carts carried residents toward restaurants built where our old picnic area had once been. The smell of grilled burgers drifted across the shoreline, blending with expensive sunscreen and gasoline from dozens of boat engines idling near the fuel dock. Music floated from outdoor speakers while children laughed and tourists posed for photographs beside a fountain that had been installed less than 20 yards from the original survey monument marking my family's property line. For several seconds, I honestly wondered if I had driven to the wrong lake. Then I noticed the old oak tree. It still stood beside the shoreline exactly where my grandfather had carved my initials into the bark when I turned 10 years old. The tree had survived every storm for decades, but now it stood trapped behind decorative stone landscaping and a polished bronze sign describing the Marina as the centerpiece of Willow Harbor Estates. That was when reality settled over me like cold rain. They had not built beside my property. They had built directly on it. I walked toward the nearest dock entrance, passing families carrying beach towels and coolers who smiled politely without realizing they were spending the weekend on privately owned land. Nobody acted like they were trespassing because someone had clearly convinced them they were not. Before I reached the security gate, a young attendant wearing a Marina uniform stepped into my path with an apologetic smile. He asked if I had a resident access card or a guest reservation. I explained as calmly as I could that I owned the lake and simply wanted to understand who authorized all of this construction. His smile disappeared, replaced by the uncertain expression of someone realizing he had stepped into a conversation far above his pay grade. Before he could answer, a white luxury sport utility vehicle rolled smoothly toward the entrance. The driver stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses, bright designer clothing, sparkling jewelry, and shoes far too expensive for gravel. Victoria Ashcroft carried herself like every sidewalk, mailbox, and flower bed existed because she allowed it. She was exactly the kind of person who expected every conversation to end with everyone agreeing she was right. She glanced at me, then at the attendant, and sighed dramatically before speaking in a voice polished by years of giving orders. She asked whether there was a problem, and before I could introduce myself, she answered her own question. She explained that the Marina was private community property reserved for residents and paying members. I told her my name. The expression on her face never changed. She simply smiled in the way people do when they think they are humoring someone unreasonable. She informed me that the previous owner had been absent for years and that the community had transformed an unused shoreline into an economic success benefiting everyone. Then she gestured proudly toward the restaurants, rental slips, and waterfront promenade as though presenting a civic achievement. I asked one simple question: who signed permission to build permanent structures on my lake? Her smile tightened just enough for me to notice. Instead of answering, she reached into a leather folder and handed me a glossy brochure advertising luxury boat memberships and seasonal events. She spoke about progress, property values, tourism, and community vision, never once mentioning ownership. Around us, residents continued enjoying their afternoon, completely unaware that the conversation happening beside the gate would soon determine the future of everything they were looking at. As Victoria finished describing her ambitious expansion plans, my eyes drifted past her shoulder toward the far end of the marina, where something small but unmistakable caught my attention. Half hidden beneath fresh landscaping stood an old concrete marker stamped with faded federal identification numbers that every hydraulic engineer would recognize immediately. Someone had built an entire waterfront development without understanding the significance of the structure they had carefully landscaped around. And at that exact moment, I realized this story was going to become much bigger than a disagreement with an overconfident homeowners association. I left the marina without raising my voice because experience had taught me that people who believe they own everything usually reveal the most when you stop arguing and simply start listening. As I drove back toward the cabin, the image of that old federal concrete marker stayed fixed in my mind. It was not decorative. It was never meant to be landscaped around or hidden beneath flower beds. It marked part of the original water control infrastructure tied to permits that predated every house in Willow Harbor Estates by decades. The moment I reached the cabin, I unlocked the storage room beneath the staircase where my father kept every property record in weatherproof metal cabinets. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight as I opened the first drawer. The familiar smell of aged paper, machine oil, and cedar instantly carried me back to weekends spent helping him organize inspection reports after every annual survey. Nothing had been moved since my last visit. Every binder still wore handwritten labels in my father's careful block lettering. Shoreline surveys, water elevation records, dam maintenance, easements, federal correspondence. I pulled several volumes onto the large oak table and began reading while evening settled outside. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered anyway. The caller introduced herself as the administrative manager for the Homeowners Association. Her tone sounded rehearsed, polite in the same way collection notices sound polite before the payment deadline expires. She informed me that the board had reviewed my behavior at the Marina entrance and considered my claims disruptive to community operations. Then she calmly explained that I would receive formal documentation regarding unauthorized interference with private amenities. Before I could respond, she thanked me for my cooperation and ended the call. The next morning, a courier drove up the gravel driveway carrying a thick, certified envelope. Inside were several documents printed on expensive paper. The first demanded that I cease entering Marina property without authorization. The second assessed a substantial fine for interfering with community business activities. The third requested payment toward annual marina maintenance expenses because, according to the attached map, my surrounding property benefited from increased neighborhood development. I actually laughed out loud. They were billing me to maintain structures standing on land and water my family had owned for nearly 70 years. Still, I forced myself to keep reading every page. Buried near the back was a professionally designed site plan showing restaurants, fuel docks, rental slips, parking areas, and future expansion phases reaching even farther along my shoreline. According to their own drawings, they intended to extend boardwalks almost to the base of the spillway itself. That was the first moment genuine concern replaced disbelief. This was no temporary misunderstanding. Someone had invested enormous amounts of money based on assumptions that should have been verified long before construction began. I decided to visit the county records office before speaking with another attorney. The clerk recognized my family name immediately and smiled, remembering my father from years earlier. When I requested recent filings connected to the lake, her expression changed. She quietly admitted there had been dozens of permits related to shoreline improvements over the past 3 years, but none carried my signature. She could not explain why. She simply printed everything available for public review. As I carried the stack of records back to my truck, I noticed something else that bothered me. Nearly every application described the waterfront as shared recreational property without specifically identifying ownership of the lake itself. That omission was too consistent to be accidental. Someone had carefully built an entire project around the hope that nobody would ever ask the simplest question of all: who actually owned the water beneath those docks? By the end of that afternoon, it felt like every door I knocked on opened just far enough to tell me the same thing. The first attorney reviewed the public filings, leaned back in his chair, and slowly removed his reading glasses. He admitted the situation looked unusual, but then he pointed toward a framed photograph of the marina hanging in a local tourism magazine. The development had become the county's newest success story. Restaurants were hiring employees. Weekend festivals attracted visitors from neighboring towns. Property values had climbed. He warned me that even if I ultimately proved ownership, challenging a project of that size could take years in court, while legal costs climbed into 6 figures. He recommended negotiating a financial settlement instead. I thanked him for his time and walked out carrying the same stack of documents I had brought in. The warm afternoon air felt heavier than before, carrying the faint smell of lake water mixed with fresh asphalt from recently paved roads leading into the development. Everywhere I looked, banners advertised waterfront concerts, boating weekends, and luxury living. Nobody questioned how any of it had appeared so quickly. That evening I drove through the community one more time without stopping. Golf carts rolled quietly beneath decorative streetlights, while families gathered around outdoor fire pits overlooking the marina. Children chased one another across lawns that had once been open shoreline. Live music drifted across the water from a restaurant patio, built almost exactly where my grandfather used to launch our small aluminum fishing boat every spring. It would have been a beautiful place if I had not known its history. The hardest part was realizing that most of the people enjoying the evening were completely innocent. They believed everything around them had been built legally because that was what they had been told. The following morning, the local newspaper published a feature praising Victoria Ashcroft for transforming an underused waterfront into an economic engine for the entire region. Her smiling photograph filled nearly half the front page. She spoke confidently about responsible development, environmental stewardship, and creating opportunities for local families. Reading those words while sitting inside the cabin my grandfather had built with his own hands left a bitter taste that even strong coffee could not wash away. Before noon, another certified envelope arrived. This time it contained notice of additional penalties if I continued making ownership claims that interfered with Marina operations. The letter even suggested that future access to portions of the shoreline might require advance approval from the Homeowners Association for safety reasons. I read that sentence twice just to make sure I had not misunderstood it. An organization that did not exist when my family purchased the property was now informing me that I might need permission to reach my own lake. I considered responding immediately, but every instinct developed through years of engineering projects told me to slow down. Rushing rarely solved complicated problems. Facts did. I spent the rest of the afternoon comparing county filings against the records stored inside my father's cabinets. The differences were subtle at first. Survey references had been simplified. Property descriptions stopped at the shoreline instead of continuing into the water. Several applications described the marina as serving an existing community lake without ever identifying who controlled water operations. Each document alone seemed harmless. Together, they painted a picture of assumptions repeated so often that everyone eventually accepted them as truth. As sunset settled across the valley, I stepped onto the cabin porch with one folder I still had not opened. Unlike the others, it carried no printed label. My father had simply written 2 words across the front in black marker. Read last. I ran my hand across the worn cover while the evening breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar and cool water through the trees. My father had organized records too carefully to leave instructions without a reason, and something deep inside me said the answers I had been searching for were waiting inside that final binder. The binder felt heavier than the others, not because it contained more paper, but because my father had clearly expected someone to open it only after every easier answer had failed. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling, and a faded rubber band still held it closed. As soon as I lifted the first page, a folded survey map slipped onto the table. Unlike the colorful copies I had collected from the county office, this one was drawn by hand, covered with engineering notes in blue ink and signed by 3 different agencies over a period of nearly 40 years. Every shoreline marker matched the locations I remembered from childhood. Every elevation benchmark matched the numbers I had memorized during my engineering training. The smell of old paper mixed with cedar from the cabin walls while evening lights stretched across the kitchen table, and for the first time since returning home, I felt something replacing frustration. Confidence. Beneath the survey rested another document inside a protective plastic sleeve. It was the original operating agreement for the spillway, signed decades before the subdivision even existed. My grandfather had worked with state engineers to create a controlled water management system that served downstream agricultural properties during dry seasons and protected neighboring land during periods of unusually heavy rainfall. The agreement did something even more important. It identified one person, and only one person, as the authorized operator responsible for adjusting water levels. Ownership of that responsibility transferred with ownership of the property itself. My name appeared in the most recent recorded assignment completed after my father's passing. I continued turning pages. Inspection reports, maintenance logs, annual engineering certifications, photographs documenting every repair made to the spillway over nearly 70 years. Then I reached a section my father had marked with a yellow tab labeled Legal References. Inside were copies of recorded easements, water rights, and correspondence exchanged between state environmental officials and previous generations of my family. One paragraph immediately caught my attention. Permanent structures extending over the managed water surface required written authorization from the operating landowner before construction. I read the sentence again, slower this time. It was remarkably simple. Nobody had permission to build fixed waterfront facilities without documented approval from the person legally responsible for water operations. I searched every page that followed. There was no authorization, no amendment, no transfer, no waiver, nothing suggesting my family had ever surrendered those rights. Instead, tucked into the back of the binder, I found a sealed envelope addressed in my father's handwriting. I unfolded the letter carefully. He explained that development pressure around the lake had increased every year, and he believed someone would eventually mistake patience for abandonment. He reminded me that engineering was never about emotion. It was about records, measurements, and procedures followed exactly as written. The final sentence stayed with me long after I finished reading. It said, "If anyone ever forgets that this lake is managed before it is enjoyed, let the documents speak louder than the arguments." I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the quiet cabin. Outside, the evening breeze moved gently through the pine trees while distant boat engines echoed across water that everyone else believed belonged to the marina. Suddenly, every strange detail from the past 2 days connected together. The hidden federal marker, the incomplete permit applications, the careful wording that avoided identifying ownership. They had not proven they possessed the necessary authority. They had simply built an entire project around the assumption that nobody would challenge it. As a hydraulic engineer, I knew something else they apparently did not. The lake level they had designed around was never guaranteed. It existed because the spillway was actively managed according to permits and seasonal operating plans. Without understanding those operating requirements, they had treated a regulated reservoir as though it were a permanent decorative pond. I looked once more at the operating schedule preserved inside the binder. Coincidentally, the annual seasonal drawdown window approved by state regulators would begin in less than 48 hours. It had been scheduled months before I returned home, exactly as it had been for decades. I smiled for the first time since arriving at the cabin because I finally understood something Victoria Ashcroft had completely overlooked. I did not need to invent a plan. My family had already written it decades earlier, and all I had to do was follow it exactly as the permits required. The next morning, I stopped thinking like a frustrated property owner and started thinking like the engineer my grandfather had raised me to become. Anger had no place in what came next. Procedures did. Before sunrise, I sat at the cabin table with fresh coffee, the operating binder open beside my laptop, and began making a series of calls that should have happened long before a single dock had ever touched the water. First came the State Water Resources Office. I confirmed the annual seasonal drawdown schedule, verified every elevation target, and requested written confirmation that routine operations would proceed exactly as authorized under the existing management plan. The supervisor recognized the permit number immediately. He thanked me for notifying the office that I would personally oversee this year's operation and emailed official confirmation within minutes. My second call went to the Environmental Compliance Office responsible for downstream flow monitoring. I reported the planned release schedule, confirmed weather forecasts, and documented every expected discharge rate. They appreciated the advance notice and reminded me to record the gate positions during each adjustment, just as previous operators had done for decades. Nothing about the conversation sounded unusual because, legally speaking, nothing unusual was happening. I was simply performing routine responsibilities attached to property my family had managed for generations. After printing every confirmation email, I drove to the county office and personally delivered copies to the clerk who had helped me the day before. She glanced through the documents, then quietly looked up at me with an expression that suggested she finally understood why I had been asking so many questions. Before leaving, I also requested certified copies of the most recent shoreline construction permits and every application referencing the marina. I wanted the official record complete before anyone realized what was coming. By late afternoon, another envelope arrived from the Homeowners Association. This time the board invited me to an emergency meeting regarding my continued claims of ownership. I accepted immediately. Their clubhouse overlooked the marina through enormous glass windows that reflected the setting sun across calm water. Residents filled nearly every chair, chatting excitedly about the grand opening celebration plan for the following weekend. Victoria Ashcroft stood confidently at the front of the room, wearing another brightly colored designer outfit that practically glowed beneath the lights. She welcomed everyone with polished confidence before turning toward me with the same practiced smile I had already come to recognize. She announced that the association had invested millions improving what she repeatedly called community waterfront property. Then she suggested my objections came from misunderstanding outdated records that no longer reflected modern development. Several residents nodded in agreement. When she finally invited me to respond, I stood, thanked the board for allowing me to speak, and placed a single folder on the table. I did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I did not threaten lawsuits. I simply informed the room that routine seasonal water operations authorized decades earlier would begin according to the existing permit schedule in less than 2 days. I explained that every required agency had already been notified and that the operation would proceed exactly as documented in long-standing agreements. Victoria smiled as though I had just admitted defeat. She laughed softly and assured everyone that routine maintenance would not affect a professionally engineered marina. Several board members joined her, joking that lakes did not simply disappear because someone carried old paperwork. I quietly gathered my folder, wished everyone a pleasant evening, and walked out without another word. As I crossed the parking lot, I noticed crews hanging banners for the upcoming waterfront festival while caterers unloaded supplies beside rows of expensive boats. Music drifted across the calm lake, and strings of decorative lights reflected beautifully on the surface. Everything looked permanent. Everything looked untouchable. Back at the cabin, I unlocked the small control building beside the spillway for the first time in months. The familiar scent of clean concrete, machine oil, and cool damp air greeted me like an old friend. Every gauge rested exactly where it should. Every inspection seal remained intact. I recorded initial water elevations, checked the gate mechanisms one final time, and signed the operating log using the same careful handwriting my father had taught me years earlier. Then I closed the binder, switched off the lights, and stepped outside beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. Less than 24 hours remained before a routine operation that had been scheduled for months would remind an entire community that water follows permits, not popularity. The alarm sounded at 4:30 in the morning, long before the first light reached the valley. Outside the cabin, the air felt cool against my face, carrying the familiar scent of damp pine needles and still water. Everything looked peaceful. If someone had walked down to the shoreline at that moment, they never would have guessed the lake was about to begin doing exactly what it had been scheduled to do every single year for decades. I unlocked the concrete control house beside the spillway and switched on the overhead lights. The soft hum of electrical equipment filled the room while the monitoring screens displayed water elevation, downstream flow rates, and gate positions exactly where the overnight readings predicted. I signed the operating log, verified every notification had been acknowledged by the State Water Office and Environmental Compliance Team, then compared the gauges one final time with the original operating schedule preserved inside my father's binder. Every number matched. Every requirement had been satisfied. At precisely 5 o'clock, I placed my hand on the primary control wheel and began opening the first spillway gate according to the permitted sequence. There was no dramatic explosion, no sudden roar. Only the steady mechanical sound of gears turning after another routine seasonal inspection. A few moments later, the water flowing beneath the spillway increased exactly as the calculations predicted. I recorded the time, adjusted the second gate according to the prescribed interval, and completed the remaining entries in the operating log. By sunrise, the lake's surface had dropped only a few inches, almost too little for anyone except an engineer to notice. I returned to the cabin, poured another cup of coffee, and watched morning mist drift across the water from the porch while birds settled along the shoreline. Around 8 o'clock, I heard the first distant boat engine. Soon another followed, then several more. Weekend visitors arrived exactly as they always did, completely unaware that the water beneath their docks had already begun following a schedule written decades before most of the neighborhood existed. Throughout the morning, I continued checking the monitoring system every hour, documenting elevations, and confirming downstream conditions remained within authorized limits. Everything unfolded with quiet precision. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Residents had begun posting photographs online asking why boat lifts suddenly looked higher than usual. Marina employees reassured everyone the change was temporary and blamed unusual weather. Victoria herself appeared in several videos confidently telling homeowners there was nothing to worry about because the association had everything under control. By late afternoon, the difference could no longer be ignored. Floating docks rested noticeably lower against their support pilings. Decorative fountains near the clubhouse stopped operating because intake pipes no longer reached the proper depth. Larger boats remained tied safely to their slips, but many now leaned gently as the water continued its slow, predictable retreat. I drove past the marina just before sunset without stopping. Workers hurried from dock to dock adjusting lines while maintenance crews inspected gangways that had suddenly become much steeper than they had been that morning. Victoria stood near the waterfront speaking into her telephone with increasing frustration, repeatedly pointing toward the spillway in the distance. She noticed my truck rolling slowly along the entrance road and waved for me to stop. I kept driving. There was nothing left to explain. She had already received every warning I was legally required to provide. During the night, I returned twice to verify operating conditions. The stars reflected across a steadily shrinking surface, while the smell of exposed shoreline began replacing the clean scent of open water. Small patches of dark lakebed appeared near the shallows exactly where historical records predicted they would. At dawn, I completed the final scheduled adjustment authorized for the seasonal drawdown and closed the control building behind me. Then I walked quietly toward a hill overlooking the marina. The view below looked completely different from only 24 hours earlier. Hundreds of feet of muddy shoreline surrounded the waterfront. Boats rested awkwardly against lowered docks. Floating walkways no longer floated. Decorative pilings stood exposed above thick black mud stretching farther every minute. Sirens echoed in the distance as emergency managers, inspectors, and television crews began arriving one after another. Victoria stepped onto the main dock, looked across the empty shoreline, and froze in complete disbelief. That was the exact moment the opening scene of this story became reality. The investigation moved much faster than anyone expected because the facts did not need dramatic speeches. They only needed records. By mid-morning, state inspectors had compared the marina construction permits with the original operating agreements stored in my family archives and the certified copies filed with the county decades earlier. Surveyors walked the exposed lakebed carrying measuring equipment, while environmental officials documented every permanent structure extending over the managed reservoir. The smell of wet clay filled the valley, replacing the scent of fuel and sunscreen that had defined the marina only 2 days before. Television cameras captured every step, but the real story was unfolding quietly inside folders spread across folding tables where inspectors compared signatures, dates, and legal descriptions line by line. Victoria Ashcroft spent most of the morning insisting that the Homeowners Association had acted in good faith. She repeated that everyone believed the waterfront belonged to the community because it had looked abandoned for years. One of the senior inspectors calmly replied that appearances never replace ownership records and assumptions never replace written authorization. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The documents spoke for themselves. Within weeks, official findings required the unauthorized structures extending over the managed water surface to be removed or brought into full legal compliance through agreements that had never existed. Construction plans were suspended. Expansion projects stopped immediately. Insurance companies began asking questions that the Homeowners Association could not easily answer. Residents who had invested in premium marina memberships demanded explanations after learning the waterfront had been developed without securing every necessary property authorization. Many of them were understandably frustrated, but several also approached me privately to apologize. They admitted they had trusted the board without ever questioning whether the project had been built on land and water that actually belonged to someone else. I never blamed those families. They had relied on the people elected to represent them. My disagreement had never been with neighbors who wanted a peaceful place to live. It had always been with leadership that believed confidence mattered more than verification. As for Victoria, she eventually stepped away from her position after the investigation concluded. The headlines that once praised ambitious development slowly disappeared, replaced by quieter stories about property rights, public records, and the importance of following established procedures before launching expensive projects. Those articles never attracted as much attention, but they contained something far more valuable than excitement. They contained the truth. Several months later, I stood once again beside the shoreline as the reservoir returned to its normal operating level according to the seasonal management schedule. Fresh water gradually covered the dark lakebed, birds returned to familiar nesting areas, and the old cedar dock I had planned to repair finally received the new boards waiting in my truck since the day I arrived. The valley sounded familiar again. Wind moved through the pine trees. Fish disturbed the calm surface every now and then. The cabin porch creaked beneath my boots exactly as it had when my grandfather welcomed me home after long weeks away. I carried his old coffee mug outside that evening and looked across a lake that no longer needed to prove who owned it. My grandfather used to say that water remembers every channel ever carved into the earth. I think people are not so different. We remember who respected what was entrusted to them, and we remember who believed shortcuts could replace responsibility. Looking back now, I never defeated anyone through anger, threats, or revenge. I simply followed the same procedures my family had respected for generations and allowed the truth to arrive at its own pace. Justice rarely announces itself with noise. More often, it arrives quietly inside old binders, careful measurements, and signatures that people forgot to read. If there is one lesson I carried away from all of this, it is that patience supported by facts will outlast confidence built on assumptions every single time. I would genuinely like to know what you think after hearing this story. Do you believe the Homeowners Association should have verified every ownership document before building such a massive project? Or do you think the situation could have been handled differently from the beginning? Share your thoughts in the comments because I always enjoy reading different perspectives. And if stories about perseverance, property rights, and justice earned through patience rather than shortcuts are the kind of stories you enjoy, I hope you will consider subscribing so we can share another journey together very soon.